Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Welcome back to Clearer Than Truth. Today, our guest is Ilan Berman, the Senior Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council, and one of the leading American experts on Iran, the broader Middle East, and Russian strategy. He's also the author of several books, including his new volume, The New Imperialist, which examines how today's revisionist powers are trying to redraw the global map. Ilan, thanks for joining us.
Yes, I just wanted to start with a quote that I sometimes return to in my own research, which is from Zbigniew Brzezinski, which is that, without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an empire, but with Ukraine, Russia is automatically an empire. And I like that quote because I think it demonstrates a dynamic that is sort of forgotten somewhat in the ongoing conflict about what Russia's intent is and how it sees itself. And so I wonder, do you have any reactions about whether that quote is still salient to the war that's going on there, or whether it has a broader set of implications?
No. So first of all, thanks, guys. This is great. It's great to sort of have. I'm a big fan of long form conversations. I think it's sort of the wave of the future. It also allows guests to get their ideas out fully. So, George, I think you're hitting on something very important, and it just so happens, right, not coincidentally, I would imagine, that this is the subject of my new book. I co-authored it with American Foreign Policy Council President Herman Kirchner, and it's called The New Imperialists, right? And it's about precisely that. So the first data point, sort of where I think the book breaks new ground, is everybody's trying to figure out how to rack and stack this ominous convergence that we're seeing between the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians, and other actors too, right? North Korea, potentially Venezuela. But they all call it different things, right? It can be an axis of aggressors, an axis of upheaval, but they don't talk a lot about the dynamics, right? And our contention in the book, The New Imperialist, is precisely that. It is the Brzezinski frame that you articulated, which is that this is all China, Russia, and Iran are the three legs of the stool, and they're being driven by imperialist impulses. In fact, if you look geographically, sort of you work your way around the clock face, everywhere that China touches, they have territorial disputes with. Virtually everywhere that Russia touches, they have territorial disputes with. And even Iran, even though it's in a comparatively weak strategic position, they also have imperial aspirations over the Strait of Hormuz, over Bahrain, and other places. And so I think that's a great common through line to highlight, because not a lot of people talk about it. And the second feature of this, which is what makes the challenge so complex, is that these imperial impulses are complementary. What China does in the Indo-Pacific doesn't cause Iran's ayatollahs to stay up at night. And what Iran does in the Strait of Hormuz actually rebounds to the benefits of Putin and his inner circle in Moscow for a whole host of reasons, right? So there may be flashpoints, right? The Russian Far East is a flashpoint between Russia and China. Central Asia is a flashpoint between all three countries. But that's in the future. That's not right now. Right now, you're seeing convergence built around this shared cooperation, this shared revisionist attempt to sort of rewrite the world order and put the United States and Europe on the back foot. And it's succeeding precisely because there's this common through line of imperialism, and there's a lot of commonality right now. There's not a lot of contradiction, at least not yet.
This is a reductive question, then I'll turn it back to George, but imperialism is expensive. What do China, Iran, and China get for their goals here? Like, the lives of their citizens are not getting better. The oligarchs do not need more money. Why do they have an imperialist drive?
So I think it's a great question, right? And I think it goes to the heart of identity, strategic culture, and sort of self-conception. Russians would never be able to convince other global peoples that their economy is in good shape, that they're really selling a vision, a construct of societal organization that other countries should adhere to. But what Putin has sold very successfully to his people is that we're a distinct civilization, we are destined for greatness. So I think the answer derives from identity and sort of self-conception, and it bleeds over into strategic culture, right? Because Vladimir Putin could never sell other publics, global publics, on the fact that the Russian model is a winning model, that there is a real sort of, there's so much economic dynamism, there's so much societal pluralism, this is really what you want to follow. What he does do, and what he has done successfully with his own people, is he's managed to convince them, hey, we're a distinct civilization. We're destined by nature, by our sort of historical culture, because, the Russian Empire stretches back almost a millennia. We are destined for greatness, right? There's no other choice but to be an empire. And this creates the frame for Russian predation in Ukraine, but also elsewhere. And, what's very telling to me is the degree to which, I've sort of spent a lot of time in Central and Eastern Europe. I just got back from a trip to the Baltics. And it was really striking to me to the degree to which government officials there and analysts there are in violent agreement that whatever starts in Ukraine doesn't end in Ukraine, right? And I think that's really lost on policymakers here in Washington, because the idea, there's this old Russian saw that the appetite comes with the eating. And if you have an imperial frame, if you believe that you are destined to control these territories anyway, it makes total sense. And then when you rack and stack the fact that there seems to be flagging American enthusiasm for support for Ukraine, the Europeans may be saying the right things, but they haven't marshaled the resources to really build the infrastructure to bring military equipment from the west of the continent to the east of the continent. These are all emboldening factors if you are already thinking in an imperial way.
Does Russia really think, and does Putin think, that you can actually sort of Russianize Ukraine?
I think it's interesting. The way if you recall the misconceptions that led preliminarily to this war, Vladimir Putin was saying things like, "Oh, well, they're going to welcome us with open arms. The war's going to take 3 days. It's going to be a cakewalk. It's going to be great." Part of that is, I think, imperial hubris. Part of that is also a very natural phenomenon. He is not a humanitarian, and I've never heard of anyone getting promoted because they told Vladimir Putin something he didn't want to hear. So it creates this authoritarian echo chamber in terms of decision making that really skews decisions. And we see this in the context, for example, in the context of Iran, right? Right up until the 12-day war of June 2025, the Iranians were in response to what was charitably feckless U.S. Middle East policy under the Biden administration. The Iranians felt emboldened to really throw their weight around in asymmetric ways, right? Through proxies, through influencing neighboring governments like the government of Iraq. And I think it led them to overestimate their staying power in a conventional military conflict. And by the way, the authoritarian nature of these countries exerts an intellectual pull. So just in recent days, we've seen the Iranian supreme leader, who apparently, even though he is 87, he is super active on social media. I think his Twitter game needs some work, frankly, but he was evangelizing on social media that Iran actually won the 12-day war. Iran handed a defeat to Israel and the United States, right? And so on one level, this is totally understandable. They got their clocks clean. They have to sort of save face a little bit. But on the other hand, I really do wonder how much he really knows the extent of the damage that was inflicted upon Iranian infrastructure by the Israelis and by the United States, because there's a vested interest in that bureaucracy not to tell him this whole story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I wonder, given that you've kind of come out of this comparative mode, looking at these different sort of empires that we have today, do you think any one particular ideology of one of these empires is the most scary or the most dangerous? I imagine it'd be a tough call. I think Iran's sort of mixture of this sort of end of times plus the desire to be a hegemon is to get plus the nuclear. But on the other hand, I'm stunned by, average Russians who I speak to who have really imbibed the idea that Russia's suffering has a purpose. And that Russia, having lost 30 million people, saved the world from fascism, right? And so, these are sort of like quite disturbing narratives because they just sort of demonstrate why Russia can continue, trying to overtake the largest country by landmass in Europe. But on the other hand, I haven't done the comparative work. So is it actually China that's the most scary? What would you say?
So I do think it's China for a very simple reason, right? They all have claims to legitimacy in terms of being civilizations, right? They all, in their domestic narrative, in their internal monologues, they all sort of harken back, right? Go back a millennia, look at the 11, 12 iterations of the Persian Empire, whatever it is, look at the rise and fall of the Middle Kingdom and the century of humiliation, and we have to restore it. What's different in the Chinese case, though, I think, is that China has a model that it's selling. Think about it in this context. If you go around what is colloquially known as the global South, right? Africa and Latin America, and you try to evangelize to them that, hey, you should really sign up to Iran's revolutionary Shia Islam. You're not going to have that many takers. You'll have some, but you're not going to have that many takers. Same thing with Russian imperialism. Russia's not selling a story about the Russian model. There is nobody in Angola and the DRC that they can convince that, hey, we're going to hitch our wagon squarely to Russia for ideology's sake. They may hitch their wagons because, their regimes are unstable and they need Russian mercenaries, but they're not making the sale in intellectual terms. The Chinese are doing something different. China has articulated a model that it's successfully sold to its own billion-plus person population, right? The trade-off between prosperity and individualism and freedom, right? And now it's exporting that, right? This model of authoritarian control is becoming a component of China's Belt and Road. So everywhere you go where China is ostensibly investing in just infrastructure, just mines, just development, I think that's only part of the story. Because I think what the Chinese are also selling is they're selling this intellectual ideological alignment that's actually very damaging, because they're telling countries that are fragile, whose economies are weak, they're telling them the Chinese model is going to provide you with a lot of dividends. And by the way, you live under a strong man anyway, right? And of course, it's a strong man. There's no strong women, right? It's a strong man. You live under a strong man anyway. You don't have that many freedoms to give away, but we can promise you prosperity. That's enormously attractive. And that's why you've seen China make such tremendous gains, not economically, but politically in the developing world, because the product sort of sells itself in a way that the Iranian model doesn't and the Russian model doesn't. So to me, that's the big difference.
Yeah. I do wonder, the sort of state capitalist, version of China's, economic growth, whether, it's replicable in other places that don't have all the sort of cash to spend. But I certainly would agree with you that they've bought a lot of sort of, I don't call it soft power, but maybe sticky power, through that kind of kind of influence. So
I think that's right. Well, and also, let's be clear. Even when they encounter governments or leaders that aren't with the program, right? You could imagine a third world leader that, for his own purposes, decides, hey, I don't want Chinese companies in my telecom sector. I don't want Huawei. I don't want Chinese origin 5G. They don't have that many options, right? Because at least at this point in time, they're not in a position to be able to turn to the United States and say, hey, do you have an alternative? Hey, UK, do you have an alternative, right? And so the Chinese very much are the only game in town. And remember, right, the iron wall of the jungle is in places like the Middle East, in places like Africa. The most dangerous animal in your ecosystem is the unemployed young male, right? Unemployed or underemployed. So especially if you're in Africa, which is the youngest continent by age in the world, it's a continent that's basically going to double its sort of continental population in the next 30 years. These guys are really concerned with keeping the unemployment rate down, occupying those young, unemployed or underemployed free radicals in the system, right? So that there aren't any protests, so there aren't any sort of widespread outpourings of discontent that could jeopardize their rule. And China can fulfill that need.
China seems more stable too. They don't change leaders. They don't have a crisis every other month. They don't have bickering within their, like we do with the House of Representatives or Senate. One of the critiques and things I think about a lot is that the U.S. doesn't seem to have a foreign policy. It bounces around a lot, not just between Democrats and Republicans, but even between Republicans. The foreign policy of 2003 kind of was dead with Republicans, but now it's kind of back.
Right.
I don't think anyone in government today has a concrete foreign policy. Obama, I think, did, though it missed quite often, which was basically pivot to Asia, get out of war, etc. Do you think that the U.S. actually could formulate a foreign policy that could stick and to counter the rise of these imperialist countries?
Well, it's interesting. I think so. Those are two separate questions, I think, because I think in a very real sense, we're seeing the Trump administration develop a distinct foreign policy mode, at least, right? Because what you're seeing, and we see this in the Israel-Gaza ceasefire peace plan. We see this in the normalization between Azerbaijan and Armenia. We see this in the sort of the most recent progress towards peace in a couple places in Africa. The innovation that this White House has made is they're not sequencing foreign policy, right? Traditionally, we do diplomacy and then we do prosperity, right? Let's normalize first and then we do trade deals and whatever it is. The innovation that Trump has made, and it has up until now, it's sort of really met with quite a degree of success, is to link them together, right? Immediate dividends. So, for example, the Armenia-Azerbaijan normalization, which happened in August, was at the same signing ceremony. Both leaders, the Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, the Azeri President Ilham Aliyev, they signed a deal signing on to the Trump route for international peace and prosperity, right? This is sort of this corridor that's going to bring in American investment, that's going to really connect both countries in a much more organic way to Europe and to the West. Here's the problem. So again, many kudos for all that. The problem that I see is that this only works with pragmatic states. This only works with states that can really see beyond ideology to realize those economic dividends in the here and now. And in the case of Russia, in the case of China, and in the case of Iran, it's not a coincidence that those are the three countries that the president is struggling with the most. These are ideological states. They value things more than simply trade. And that's where I think this administration is going to have a lot of problems.
This is a little bit it's a little bit of a different question, and forgive the pause. I'm just trying to think about how to organize this. I think you've written, or I've seen a post or something you've written recently about how this isn't just Russia has an agenda, Iran has an agenda, China has an agenda, but you've alluded to it being coordinated a bit. They all have dramatically different interests. How are they coordinating, and what is their end game in doing so?
Well, it's interesting because it's coordinated until it's not, right? And what I mean by this is that in the absence of a forcing function, in the absence of somewhere where one, two, or three of the leaders have to make hard choices, they're perfectly happy to coordinate on, non-dollar denominated economic trade. They're perfectly happy to coordinate on trilateral military exercises. They're really running the table on coordinating in terms of disinformation, right? They're sharing, fake news and false narratives, all intended to dent the credibility of the West, all intended to cast doubt on democratic societies, et cetera, et cetera. But when push comes to shove, this alignment actually looks more fragile than you would think, right? So again, I mentioned the 12-day war of June before. To me, the most striking factor of the 12-day war was that the Russians and the Chinese didn't show up, right? The Iranians fully expected, certainly when the Israelis were attacking them, but maybe even when the U.S. joined the fight as well, they expected to get more than simply rhetorical support from Moscow and Beijing, and they didn't. And so the period since then we've seen a flurry of Iranian delegations going to Moscow, going to Beijing, trying to figure out what went wrong. How do we solidify these partnerships? Because when push came to shove, you guys weren't there. To me, that bespeaks limits to the no limits partnerships that these guys have developed. And I think one of the most constructive things that American strategists can do is to try to figure out where those fault lines are. Where do they trust each other? Where don't they trust each other? Let's see if we can be competitive, if we can pull them apart a little bit. Because agglomerated together, those three countries are a huge problem. I mean, America is a comparatively young country. We faced imperial adversaries before, but we've never faced three of them at the same time. And we've certainly never faced three of them that are cooperative, right? They're working together. So my first thought goes to, let's figure out the exact scope of the problem that we're dealing with, and let's try to start pulling it apart and dealing with the constituent parts.
Yeah. So I have to ask, have you had a chance to take a look at the national security strategy that was released last night?
No, not yet. I find it actually remarkable that this is a document that everybody in this space has known that is coming, but the White House sort of dropped it with no announcement. It was sort of no disclosure, no public rolling out ceremony. So we're all getting drips and drabs of it. So I haven't read the full thing, but like you guys, I would imagine I've gotten, here's what it says about Iran because somebody that works on Iran is outraged at this particular thing, or this is what it says about China because some sinologist thinks it should say something different, right? But my weekend reading is precisely this.
Okay, well, I mean, I'm sure you want to read the document, and I don't want to, ask you to respond to it before you've taken a look. But I mean, it's been part of the administration's conversation for some time that there's going to be this kind of Western Hemisphere focus. What I jokingly referred to when I was at DHS as the Don Rowe doctrine, which I know now is being actually used in the media to describe it. But right. I'm fascinated by this because, there's this assumption I think people have that the Monroe Doctrine, is a kind of bellwether or a moniker or, another name for isolationism. Whereas, as a child of the Pacific, whose state was in 1869 folded into the Monroe Doctrine, I've always seen this as a profoundly internationalist instrument, right? It's a way of U.S. consolidating its own position and safety so that it can, prioritize what else it wants to do in the rest of the world. And I wonder, do you see a tension there between confronting these imperialist ideologies while at the same time reaffirming the Monroe Doctrine? Or are they one and the same? Do they go hand in hand?
No, I think they go hand in hand. And I'm for years I've been a big booster of this sort of revival of the Monroe Doctrine for a very simple reason. This goes, I think, all the way back to 2005, 2006, when John Kerry made the. No, it must have been later than that. Sorry, let me start over. I think they're complementary. And all the way back in I think it was the first Obama term, when then Secretary of State John Kerry made that speech before the Organization of the American States and said, the Monroe Doctrine is over. I was spending a lot of time in the Western Hemisphere, and I was talking to regional governments in Central and South America. And I was wondering, my question to them was always, how are you guys reading this? And their answer was twofold. America's not interested, and America has just invited in external actors, right? Because if we are no longer abiding by the Monroe Doctrine, what the Chinese and the Russians, and by the way, also the Iranians, the Turks and others, what they're hearing is this is empty political space that can be filled, right? We just have to get there and we have to fill it. So I'm a big booster of the concept in general. This is our geopolitical backyard. I know that's sort of a somewhat pejorative term, but this is you can't escape geography. This is the area where we should be allocating a tremendous amount of focus. Historically, we haven't. We absolutely should. But the question to me, and I don't really have an answer, and I don't think I'm going to find the answer in the national security strategy when I read it over the weekend. But the sort of lingering question to me is, how much are we going to put our money where our mouth is? How much are we actually going to go downrange and compete with Chinese investment, with Russian military basing, with Iranian ideological influence in Central and South America? Because we haven't been so far. And if we're really reviving this concept, it means that we're going to be doing hemispheric competition. And I don't know what that looks like. And I don't know with enough clarity what the administration thinks it looks
But and George, if you have a follow up, go ahead. But do you think we're spread too thin in that regards? I mean, right now, the Trump administration is blowing up boats, smuggling allegedly drugs into the U.S. They're putting out a crisis every day, while on the other hand, the others seem pretty locked in, pretty focused. Are we taking our eye off of the 50 and 100-year challenges to focus on things that are just going to inevitably happen, like drug running?
It's a good question. I think the problem that I see is slightly different. It's not that we're overstretched. It's that we are so siloed in how we approach foreign policy. And we think that these issues are, sort of what happens in the Western Hemisphere stays in the Western Hemisphere, what happens in Europe stays in Europe, that we make decisions and the administration is making choices that rebound to the detriment of its strategy in other theaters, right? If anything else, coming off of this, comparative research, this year of comparative research on Russia, China, Iran, I'm uniquely struck by the fact that they're talking to each other all the time. The Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians are talking to each other all the time. So what we do in one theater, that lesson is learned in another theater. So in the context of American steadfastness on Ukraine, the Iranians are drawing conclusions. The Chinese are drawing conclusions. And the countries that they're threatening, countries like Taiwan, countries like Bahrain in the Gulf, right? They're drawing conclusions too, which is that America is preoccupied over there and they don't understand how it impacts us. And so I'm really sort of struck by the fact that, we need to take a broader frame in terms of understanding the challenges. And in many cases, because we're not yet taking a broader frame, some of these decisions that we're making are contradictory, right? So, for example, in the phase 2 of the Gaza plan, right? Phase 1 is the ceasefire. Phase 2 is supposed to be reconstruction and security and de-radicalization. The partners of choice should be countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. But those same countries have said, you know what, we're not going to dive in earnest unless you can find a way to marginalize Hamas, to marginalize this sort of radicalism that we've seen in the Gaza Strip up until now. But other countries like Turkey and Qatar, they have tenser relations with Hamas. They're perfectly willing to dive in right now. And the end result, right, because the administration is now a stakeholder in this enterprise, the path of least resistance runs right through Hamas retaining some political salience in the Gaza Strip, right? So it runs counter in practice to what the administration has articulated in theory. So it's that incoherence that I think is a problem.
What should the U.S. do to divide Russia, China, and Iran? When we had a similar thing with Iraq, North Korea, and whoever else George Bush threw in with his axis of evil speech, there was a plan. Right. How do we divide the three?
I think it's a good question. I think, and again, right, to harken back to the book, I think sort of most of it turns on deterrence, and not just American deterrence, right? Deterrence of America and its allies collectively. And in this particular case, there's a lot to be desired. Not so much in the Indo-Pacific. In the Indo-Pacific, there are things that we can build, but there are countries that are seized of the China threat. What I think I'm seeing is serious gaps in Europe, right? So, as I said, I just came back from a fact-finding trip to the Baltics, and I was struck by the degree to which Central and Eastern European governments are fully seized of the danger of Russia going beyond Ukraine. And they're perfectly willing to accept European statements of solidarity. But what they're not seeing is real European building on those statements and really providing resources. And the number that I heard that blew me away, and I heard this from NATO officials, was that as of right now, it would take, in worst case scenario, it would take large amounts of kit, right? Tanks and armored personnel carriers and whatever it is. It could take as much as 45 days to travel from the west of the European continent to the Eastern Front, right? 45 days. We are almost 4 years into this conflict. The fact that we are still in this state is frankly unacceptable. And the Europeans, to their credit, they're now talking about it. The European Commission passed a plan last month talking about a military Schengen zone, essentially easing the ability of these armies to sort of move around. But it's not just regulation. It's also things like reinforcing bridges, widening tunnels, strengthening roads. That's going to take time. And so if you're Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping and the supreme leader of Iran, and you look at this scenario, what you're seeing is the West is talking a good game, but they're not putting their money where their mouth is. Not really. And it's an emboldening thing.
When you say going past Ukraine, what would that look like? And would the U.S. be in response in Europe to actually respond forcefully?
Well, it's interesting. And in the book, my co-author and I, Herman, we spend a lot of time going through the active territorial disputes that each country has. And they're far more extensive than most people realize. And, if you're in Russia and you're just an ordinary Russian and you go about the day, you may have heard about Norway's Svalbard Peninsula and have some vague idea. But the reality is, the Russians contest the treaty, the 1945 treaty that they signed, that the Soviet Union signed on to, that says Svalbard is Norwegian. They want to rewrite it. And they are making statements now, as in like several days ago, talking about, hey, we have to reclaim these lands. We can't give up our sovereignty over these lands. So what it actually looks like is Russia, in the context of Russia, looking at places where there are open territorial disputes. And that may be, with regard to, the provinces, self-declared independent provinces of Georgia. That may be through subversion in places like Moldova if they're successful next time. There's different ways to sort of skin the cat, but it's very clear that the Russians have articulated a vision that sees not just the reconstitution of the Soviet Union. I think it's very facile to talk about the reconstitution of the Soviet Union. But if you look at what Vladimir Putin actually says, he sees himself much more as a czar than as a commissar, right? And in fact, he's reserved some of his harshest criticism for Joseph Stalin, not because Stalin was a terrible Soviet leader, right? I mean, we think he was, right? But Putin does not. But because Stalin, before he was general secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, was the commissar of nationalities, right? Because when the Soviet Union expanded, right, into places that had previously been filled by the Russian Empire, there were all these ethnicities that they had to bind together. And Stalin, for something like 12 years, was the commissar of nationalities. And Putin's main complaint was that the type of autonomy that the Ukrainians and other nationalities got at that time has convinced them now that they're real nations. And they're not real nations, and we should take them over, right? And so what you actually hear Putin saying in his messaging to his own people, right, because all politics is local, is that, I don't just want to recreate the Soviet Empire. The structure is fine, but I want to recreate an imperial frame where we leech sovereignty and independence from all these different ethnicities. Everybody looks to Moscow.
This might be a tad morbid, but at some point, Putin and the Ayatollah and the Chinese leaders, they're going to die. But they seem right now particularly awful in the eyes of the U.S. Will the leaders who come after them have the same policy towards imperialism?
It's really interesting because so I'm the product of Soviet refuseniks. So my parents came out of the Soviet Union in the 1970s, and they would always tell this joke about how during a sort of late stage Soviet Empire, you would get people who were praying for, they would go to church, they would pray for the death of, whoever it was, Khrushchev or Brezhnev or whoever it was. And there would always be a babushka, an old Russian lady, praying for the health of the leader, like for him not to die. And the joke goes, oh, babushka, why are you praying for, the things are terrible. Why are you praying for this? And the answer is always, because we know how bad it is now, but we don't know how bad it's going to get. Right? So there is that sort of that fatalism that's sort of baked into, certainly in underperforming places like Iran, like Russia. I think there's great merit to trying to figure out alternative futures, like which direction Iran will go, for example. We just, again, plug for our work, but at the American Foreign Policy Council, we did earlier this fall, we put out a study on alternative futures for Iran. Right. And we spent a lot of time. We had a whole bunch of workshops with subject matter experts. And the three scenarios that they really came up with were Iran is post-Mao China, as in, right, Mao dies in the latter 1970s. And at that time, the CCP is basically an international pariah. And his successor, Deng Xiaoping, comes in and says, you know what? We have to make the trains run on time. We have to reintegrate into the global economy. We don't have to give up our ideological fervor, but we have to sort of to temper it with competence. And so what you have is and Deng making that choice really set the stage for what we now know as China's peaceful rise, right? So set the stage for everything that followed. There are elements of that are already happening within Iran in terms of technocracy, in terms of trying to fix the banking system. They're falling down on the water situation, clearly, right now, right? Because they're talking about moving Tehran to other places in the country and moving the capital because there's not enough water in the aquifers that feed Tehran. But you do see telltale signs that they're working on this sort of technocracy thing. The second scenario is Iran is Maduro's Venezuela, right? As in regime collapse. We talk about regime collapse a lot. Regime collapse is not one thing. Regime collapse can be many things. And in the context of Venezuela, we've seen partial regime collapse. We've seen Venezuela lose control of its borders. Venezuela, the crisis in Venezuela creating the largest outflow of refugees in the known world, right? And yet at the same time, the regime is still coherent and the regime still clings to power, but it doesn't control its periphery and it's increasingly dependent on other powers like Russia and China. We're seeing that in Iran as well. But to me, the most compelling scenario is the Iran is post-Soviet Russia scenario, right? Because that's the third one. And that, to me, that's the most germane because Iran, very much like the Soviet Union did, has a true deep state. The Revolutionary Guards control a third or more of the national economy. They are the custodians of all the regime's strategic programs, nuclear, ballistic missile. They control the proxies. They're not going to go quietly. And so history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. And so what happened in the Soviet Union, right, under the first year of Boris Yeltsin's rule, was Yeltsin, at least preliminarily, tried to disaggregate and defang the KGB, right? He dissolved the organization, and those apparatchiks had a choice to make. We could either sort of retire and go sort of lick our wounds, or we could fight back against the system. And they chose the latter. And so what you had was a period of 13 months, at the end of which they had reconstituted, reformulated themselves as the FSB and other organizations. And the culmination of this was the appointment of Vladimir Putin at the end of the decade, right, a former KGB colonel, as the head of state, right? So I think that's a very interesting dynamic to think about in the context of Iran, right? What is that going to mean? Is that going to mean that Iran is just a military dictatorship? It's not so ideological, or are they going to be ideological? Is the sort of the whole missionary nature of the current regime, is that going to go away? But all this stuff, doing it for Iran, doing it for Russia, doing it for China, I think it would do us as an establishment and as a sort of a intellectual community, it would do us a lot of good.
I don't want to take much more of your time, but as a follow-up, the day after the president of Iran and defense minister died, I think, last year, summer of 2024, we had Arash Azizi on, who had just written a book about General Soleimani, the shadow commander. Yeah. Great guy, friend of ours. And we debated, would Iran try to show some teeth after the death to sort of show that they still matter? In my eyes, at least, in the last 6 years, after the death of Soleimani, the death of the president, the death of the defense minister, the conflict in Israel, nothing actually has ever happened. Am I missing something? It seems like they speak a big game, but they're kind of quiet and they don't actually want to
Right.
fuck around and find out.
They talk a big game. And first of all, I think, I've read Arash's book. I think it's a great book. And he does a really good job of sort of sussing out just how pivotal Soleimani was to the edifice of the Islamic Republic. As
him walking around the Kremlin, demanding resources for Assad. It's the guy just seems terrible but awesome and powerful.
Terrible but awesome. Yeah. I don't know that I would take the step of lionizing him on whatever Showtime show, whatever they did on Imad Mughniyeh recently. But anyway, yes, a force to contend with. And this is, by the way, this is exactly where my criticism of Trump 1 comes from. They correctly identified Soleimani as being the super empowered actor, right? He would have been a shoo-in to be the national president, right? Had he not been assassinated. And the problem that I saw in the way the Trump administration approached this was they identified the root of the problem and then they didn't follow on with any action. So I remember I talked to Frank McKenzie was the head of CENTCOM at the time, right? He was sort of in the room when they made the decision. And I remember asking him at a public event a couple of years ago whether what happened with regard to Soleimani, whether that was intended to be the start of a campaign to really pull apart the proxies, or it was intended as a one-off event. And he said, no, we never thought about going further. It was always intended to be a one-off event to reestablish American deterrence. Candidly, I thought that was a real mistake because when you have a country like Iran, which is ideological in nature, which doesn't have a strategic triad the way we do, the way the Russians do, when they rely heavily on proxies and on asymmetric warfare, having the ability to pick apart one of their most vital, most important and impactful strategic tools, it's not just a question of assassinating one guy, right? We have to go further. So I was really struck by the fact that, if you were to cycle forward to 2023 and, Soleimani's gone, but you're 2.5, 3 years into this cycle and the proxy network is vibrant, to the point that the proxy network is coordinating an eliminationist campaign jointly against the state of Israel. Now, they didn't all sort of work in tandem, but that was clearly the objective for them to work in tandem, right? For Hamas to do a sort of a southern front, for Hezbollah to do a coordinated northern front. So I think we missed a real opportunity because Soleimani was the glue that held the network together. And if the network started falling apart, we should have been there to give it an additional push, right? To put all these proxies out of business, because in the absence of American pressure, we have given them the breathing room to really put themselves back together.
I mean, look, in defense of the Trump administration, to which I would criticize until I run out of breath, it's easy to forget how scary ISIS was just 5, 6, 7 years ago. Do you think there's a world where we benefited by allowing for sort of the Shia crescent to exist, for the somewhat more normal Shia leaders to take on ISIS and the Sunni sort of terrorists and extremists out of the region? That was kind of the theory with Syria, right? Don't get involved because you don't know.
Right. I was thinking of Syria when you were asking the question. I mean, it's interesting to me because what's happened in Syria is either deeply alarming or somewhat encouraging, depending on what file you work on. If you work on the Sunni jihadist file, you're sort of caught somewhere in the middle, right? Because it is problematic that a one-time affiliate of Al-Qaeda is now in charge. And it's delightful that the current president of Syria has trimmed his beard and he wears Western suits, but he was not so long ago on the U.S. foreign terrorist list. At the same time, if you work on Iran, you have to notice that the HTS takeover and the animosity that the Sunni jihadist front has to Iran has really cut off Iran's land bridge to Syria and to Lebanon. It has interrupted Iran's attempts to demographically change over the composition of the Syrian population, right, which they had started to do by importing Shia civilians as well as fighters. And so if you're looking at that, it's a net win. If you're looking at it from the sort of the broader extremist microcosm, then I think it's a little bit more problematic. And by the way, this is precisely the sort of the situation that the Israelis find themselves in, because I talk to Israeli experts and officials a lot, and what I've been hearing from them for almost a year now is, oh my God, we were so focused for basically a generation on the Iranian threat, the sort of the Ring of Fire, the Shia Crescent, that we really, as President George W. Bush would say, we misunderestimated the Sunni problem, right? We really didn't keep our eyes close enough on the Sunni problem. And now we're waking up to a situation where the Ring of Fire is at least partially dismantled. But what you now have is a Sunni Islamist / Muslim Brotherhood axis driven by Qatar, driven by Turkey, that are both trying to exert influence over Syria, with varying degrees of success. And they don't quite know how to deal with that, right? So the situation in one way has gotten better, but in another way it's gotten equally concerning.
Final question, then we'll let you go. I know you've given us almost an hour, but do you think the U.S. has to pick between a Shia route or a Sunni route? And have they not already picked by becoming closer with Saudi and MBS?
So I don't think it's an either or proposition, because I actually think there's more players in the game. Because yes, it's absolutely true that you have a Iranian revisionist axis. Right, this is Iran, this is Shia militias in Iraq, this is Hezbollah, even though Hezbollah is now diminished in terms of stature in Lebanon, they're not out of the fight yet. And you also have this emerging Sunni Muslim Brotherhood axis, right, in the context of Turkey, in the context of Qatar, and they're not the same, but they share an affinity for the Muslim Brotherhood. They've sort of had this open door. But there's also a third block, this stability block. And here I'm thinking about countries like Morocco and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates that really have taken a searching look inside and said, you know what my people need is prosperity. We need to move beyond dependence on a single commodity, in the Saudi case, oil, right? To focus on AI, to focus on technology, to focus on broad-based prosperity in a way that would rebound to our people and would stabilize our societies, right? I think it makes imminent sense for the United States to invest in the stability bloc, because there is a real sense that that's the bloc that you can do business with in the context of this administration. This administration has, made very clear that it wants to do business with the Saudis and the Emiratis. That's where the money is. But also, that's the architecture that sets up long-term stability. After this administration, when we look at building a regional architecture that sidelines radicals, those are going to be your building blocks.
Thank you for that. That was articulated and laid out better than anyone else. And I do think most people think you have to pick Saudi or Iran. For our listeners, where can they find your book? I know it came out yesterday.
No, I appreciate you circling back to that. So the book is called The New Imperialists. It's on Amazon. And thanks to the glory of modern technology, it's all print on demand now. So you can actually get it before the holidays if you order.
Fantastic.
If you order now, you can get the Kindle version immediately, right? But I'm an old fashioned guy, as I know you guys are, right? So I like the hard copy. So it's called The New Imperialists, and I hope your listeners pick it up. If they want to sort of look at some of the reports that I mentioned and whatever it is, you can find the American Foreign Policy Council online at www.afpc.org.
Very
Wonderful.
good.
Well, thank you so much for the time.
Thank you so much.
That's it for this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed the conversation, please subscribe, leave a review, and share the episode.